Today, we're going to have a very interesting conversation around open source with the title of Open Source Beyond GitHub. This presentation is being put on by Johns Hopkins Technology Ventures, and we're very thankful for the folks at Fast Forward, including Mark Vanderzijl, who's basically worked to put all the details together to get our speakers here today and to get this program organized and ready to go. A couple of comments before we start. The participants will all be muted, but we do encourage you to engage with the panelists in the chat or the Q&A section that are run by the widget at the bottom of your screen. We will track questions and try to get to the audience questions before the end of the program. It's only a 1-hour program, but we will try to get to that. We are recording this session and we'll post it to the Johns Hopkins Tech Ventures website or YouTube channel or something in the next week or so. So if there's any sections you missed or would like to go back over, you are able to do that then. I'd like to thank our panelists today, Randal, Sayeed, Dan, and Andrew, for doing this. They each come at open source from a different perspective and have very interesting sort of tales to tell and comments to make about open source and how it's useful both in university academic settings as well as in the commercial market. And so with that, I will ask each of the panelists to in turn introduce themselves and talk a little about sort of their background relative to open source. Randal, you want to start?
Sure. Give me a target time. Being a professor, that's always dangerous.
Try 5 to 7 minutes. Start there.
Okay, I won't do 5 to 7 minutes. Hi, I'm Randal Burns. I'm currently professor and head of computer science at Johns Hopkins. But talking about open source, I should really talk both about my time as founder and chief scientific officer of a company called Gigantum, and also academically. I created a project called neurodata.io. And so I got really passionate about open science. Came to Hopkins, there were these incredible open science projects like the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. One of the first things I did was build an open turbulence database. And this was really focused on creating massive data resources and making them available to the community. And data is not useful without ways to interpret data. And so you have to have open software for open data. And so it was building a lot of open software and publishing software through open source licenses from academia on these major data sets. And so that was just kind of my operation. I was working towards open science outside of looking to commercialize data or trying to generate intellectual property. In the process, we identified that there was this huge reproducibility problem in science where people ran complex workflows against data. And this was particularly, we were focused on neuroscience workloads that did brain imaging. So particularly this specific area of connectomics, where you're trying to extract circuits from images of the brain. And these workloads are very hard to repeat and share. And that led to both a project to create reproducible tools and then a company. And so the ethos of the company was coming from this open science community. And so it was very natural for us to make open source software. But then as we got into this, we realized that our software was building on this set of tools. At the time, Jupyter Lab, Docker, Anaconda, GitLab, that all were these mixed models for open source software and services or enterprise editions. And this model is very powerful. Open source really creates trust among users. And you can't overstate how important it is to have trust among your users. As a open scientist, an open data scientist, I would really only use open source tools. And if there weren't tools where I could inspect or debug them or felt like there was a community that could address their needs, working with an opaque software tool that's licensed, that the pricing structure can change, was just very risky. So from a business model standpoint, we wanted to work with all open source software. And then having our tool be open source then created users that really were willing to engage with it for the same reasons. I think we'll talk more about business models for open source and how to monetize it. And that was that was part of the adventure. We sold Gigantum, this reproducible data science platform, to Nvidia a year and a half ago, and with the sale to Nvidia, it is no longer open source, which brings me great sadness. And with that, I think I'm under 7 minutes.
I think you made it. You're in good shape. No, you're in great shape. That's awesome. Interesting, your comment about trust. We should definitely come back to that, because I think that is an interesting aspect of this whole thing, the whole notion of community engagement and trust around open source software. Sayeed, do you want to take a shot next?
Sure. Sayeed Choudhury. I'm the director of the Open Source Programs Office at Carnegie Mellon University, formerly from Johns Hopkins. So I'm actually a graduate of Hopkins Engineering, alumnus, and was running the Open Source Programs Office at Johns Hopkins as well, as part of a larger group called Digital Infrastructure Application and Services out of the libraries. I am also based in the Carnegie Mellon libraries as well. So trained engineer, but have spent most of my career in libraries. My own experiences with open source software, not surprisingly, have to do with some large open source projects that came out of the library community, but also interacted with broader university open source efforts like Sakai and uPortal. Most recently, I mentioned this Open Source Programs Office, or OSPO. This was actually an idea that was brought to me by another Hopkins alumnus named Jacob Green. It's a bit of a movement, if you will. There are a few universities now that have these OSPOs. And an OSPO has both an internally facing and externally facing sort of mission or remit. Internally acting as a center of competency, in essence, for open source software. So if a university wishes to take an intentional strategy in terms of identifying, managing, curating, sharing open source software, the OSPO is a good way to think about doing that. In terms of building a community within the university itself, so finding like-minded folks and maybe people who don't know much about open source, but try and build a community around that. In that effort to identify best practices, share code, work together, collaborate around projects like the kinds that Randall talked about, for example. A little bit in the external side, I do think trust is a really important aspect of open source. At Hopkins and starting at Carnegie Mellon, we've started to see how open source can be a way for universities to work with local community organizations in very different ways. And some of that has to do with that trust dimension of open source software. But if we think about a growing network of university OSPOs, there are other things we can think of at larger scale, national, maybe even global scale. There's been quite a few federal policy statements, memos that have come out that are related to open source software. There's growing interest from the federal funders around open source software. What is the university community's response going to be? Maybe even more than response, what is our strategy going to be, so that we can actually influence how these policies get developed and not just react to them when they come out. And then there are questions around how does the university voice get represented in the open source community. So broadly speaking, open source came out of universities. There was sort of a hiatus, maybe, I don't know. But the private sector kind of picked up on it and ran with it, but did some good things. They came up with a set of canonical licenses. There's organizations like the Open Source Initiative that manages those licenses. They do have lots of software engineering practices that have to be adapted, but could be looked at, for example. So given this interest in open source from the government, the private sector, and now universities, how do we bring all that together? And I think an OSPO is a very good way to do that, but we can talk more about that during the panel itself.
Great, awesome. Dan, you're up.
My name is Dan Roche. I'm basically at the tail end of being a serial entrepreneur pretty much all my life. I had the good fortune to build a number of build and or buy and or take public a few software companies. I think I'm responsible for about nine companies over the last 30 years, and come at it purely from a private market perspective. What is the value of open source or taking an open source approach to building a business? and what are the strategies to monetize that. I've been a mentor in residence at Hopkins out of the JHTV group for coming up on 10 years now, I think. Have been very involved in helping launch a number of software-based companies out of Hopkins, OncoSpace, EpiWatch, MileMarker, Emoca, a number of companies. And right now I have a company called Qualitics, which is a data quality company, and have some thoughts and opinions on the purpose of open source when it comes to building a product that you want to take to market. How does open source play in taking a product to market, growing a community, growing your user base, getting adoption, learning from the community? There's a lot of very valuable things that can be done there. So that's a little bit of the perspective I'll bring to the conversation.
Great, thanks, Dan. No, that'll definitely be interesting. And then Andrew, last but not least.
Hey, good afternoon. So I'm Andrew Wichmann. I work for Johns Hopkins Technology Ventures. I manage intellectual property for the university within that organization. Before I came here, I was an intellectual property lawyer, primarily in software technologies, both for an early stage company and then for 6 years in private practice. Spent a lot of time thinking about patents, obtaining patents, litigating patents, defending patents, doing a lot of patent-centric things. I came to JHTV, which, for those on the call who don't know, JHTV provides a tech transfer function for Johns Hopkins University. So we, facilitate the mission of the university to translate technology into the world for benefit. Historically, that has been done in universities through obtaining and licensing patents. That is like the origin story for all tech transfer in the US, and is a major part of what we do. I think by nature of just the type of technologies I work on, I encounter open source projects every day. Open source issues infect and have something to do with almost everything I work on. And I think if you abstract from the mission of JHTV and of the university, we're trying to transfer technology out of the university. Open source does that for a certain domain of technologies better than patent or formal IP licensing. It is more efficient, it has greater impact. It certainly facilitates collaboration and research, which is another huge part of the fundamental part of what a university should be doing. So that's the perspective I take on it. We at JHTV are working to facilitate open source as a significant part of what we do in technology transfer for the university. So that's my perspective.
Great. Yeah, Andrew and I just came from a meeting this morning where we had a whole conversation with a group that had built some prostate cancer analysis, longitudinal prostate cancer analysis based on open source. And we had a whole conversation about what was the value of open source. Certainly it allowed, well, first the grant required some open source release of something, obviously. Then there was obviously the academics' interest in promulgating what they had done and letting the world see it. And then obviously sort of the shared and community aspect of it in terms of others taking the algorithms and then enhancing them over time, perhaps with their own data sets and basically, proving them out further. So you talk a little about, for those of us who are not like completely versed in OSPOs, like, can you tell us kind of a little bit, is this a national thing? Is there a global standard for OSPOs? Like, how does that work and what exactly do you do?
Yeah, I wouldn't say there's a standard per se, but the OSPO concept has been in the private sector for some years now. So it's not necessarily a new concept. And that, this is not just the usual suspects you would imagine, the Microsofts, the Googles of the world, but companies like American Airlines and Walmart, they have OSPOs. So depending on what number you read or believe, 90% to something like 95% of all code right now uses open source software or is released as open source software. So American Airlines is using open source software. There's GitHub had its annual conference. Somebody from Mercedes spoke about automobiles as a software platform, right? My television is a software platform right now. It's got a bunch of apps running on it all the time. So it's everywhere. So the private sector organized into these so-called OSPOs, open source program offices, as a means of doing some of the things I described, managing the software, thinking about how software engineering development happens, the license choices, risk mitigation, all those wonderful things that you do when you have software development activity happening and it's released out to the public. But a corporate environment is very different than a university one, right? So one metaphor I've given is Microsoft has a CIO and a head of HR, and so does Johns Hopkins. And they deal with many of the same kinds of things, I'm sure. But Hopkins has students and it has patients, which Microsoft does not. And Microsoft, has ways of enforcing license choices and software engineering practices in a way that will never work in a university context. I said this just last week at the GitHub conference, is we don't have software developers and engineers, actually. We have researchers, and many of them are producing software. So that's a very important distinction. So the OSPO in the university context is building on this corporate model. And they organized into something called the to-do group, which is basically just like a birds of a feather. If you run a corporate OSPO, can you come together and share stories and how you resolve issues and so on? We're not trying to do that in the university context through an organization called OSPO++. So if universities have their OSPOs and have to adapt that model, what are the best practices we can develop around that? But the other piece that I point out is the impact, right? So universities can have impact beyond the walls of the university through open source software in a way that is, got a lot of potential. And there's some early successes and examples, including some work happening out of Hopkins. But how we do that in a more intentional way, in a more organized way. And then ultimately, is there the same kind of potential in the government sector, right? So imagine governments are certainly using open source software. Some of them are producing them. Do they want to think about organizing a set of OSPOs to do that work? I've said recently that I became an administrator at Hopkins. So my research profile, if you look at my Google Scholar H index, it just plummeted in the last 5-10 years. But when I used to do research in digital infrastructure, if you look at the development of the internet and the web, it was a triad of universities, government, and corporations working together, right, in a balanced kind of way. And I believe the same thing is true of open source software in terms of its potential impact, but you need that triad of those three different organizations. So OSPOs are, I've used this term, an organizational API, right? Well, what's the value of an API? I don't want to know about the complexity behind your code. I don't. I just want to know how to interact with it. So companies have said this to me, that they approach at Hopkins or Carnegie Mellon. They don't even know who to talk to, where to start, what office, what person. They get different answers, so on. Can an OSPO be a place where someone goes and says, I need to learn about your open source in this way? And they don't care who the OSPO ends up talking to or works with or so on. They just want to know there's a point of contact. So imagine all those different organizational APIs, seeing all these different organizations through OSPOs. What are we able to do if we have that working effectively?
So the ideal is as a network of OSPOs, basically all interacting with each other.
Exactly. I mean, there's a lot of utility for an individual institution, no doubt, but that network effect, I think, is where the real promise lies.
And that's one of the beauties of open source anyway, is basically the whole community contribution to the coordinate. Talk a little about it. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to add one last thing, that one very interesting thing I've heard from people in the private sector is if you put your code in GitHub, it's open code, right? If you build a community around it, then it's open source software. That's an important distinction.
Yeah, that's interesting, because we came from a meeting not long ago where somebody said, wait, open source, that just means I post my stuff to GitHub and I'm done, right? That's all and I'm like, well, not exactly, but interesting comment. Randal, do you want to talk a little bit about your startup experience? Like, why did you choose open source as kind of a platform and a proposal? And did that create additional challenges or additional opportunities for you?
So I would say it didn't hinder the business at all. And this to some extent goes to one of the founding stories of this business. So the business was started with two contracts. One was a small business innovative research grant, which is a program for all funding agencies that have a mandate to spend some of their money seeding businesses. And the other one was a contract from a major internet company, Facebook at the time, now Meta. And so I'm going to tell this by way of anecdote why open source was incredibly important to our business model. So for the Facebook contract, we wrote the contract said, you have to prove to us that there are no licenses in the software that you're delivering to us that encumber the software and prevent our use. And so it's not just that we weren't using commercial software, there's actually kinds of open source licenses that are restrictive, that are very toxic. And so one of the funniest pieces of software I wrote, and as a small business person, you don't get to choose what you do it all. And this also means you write weird pieces of software, is I wrote a continuous integration checker so that every time any code was committed to our project, that as part of integration, it would pick up all the licenses that code touches and validate that they were in our whitelisted license category. And this was just if you to avoid a development problem where we get to go deliver the code and then check later and say, oh, darn, we messed this up. And so I felt like being in an open source company with a permissive license was critical to every step of the business. It was consistent with our ethos as scientists trying to create open data. It was consistent with our user community, who, the data science community, both professionally and academically, really likes open tools. And just ask your favorite PhD student about their opinion of MATLAB, and you will gain some insight into this. And then this story about Facebook, I think, is very typical. And so this goes to trust. And I said trust before, and and maybe it's not trust, maybe it's verify, right? I want to be able to have access to software. I want that access to not go away. I want to be able to introspect that software is doing the right thing. And, the way information flows through it, their security practices, all of this can be audited and improved and open sourced in a way it can't in closed software communities.
And is that just because there's so many people touching it or can't touch it that they can basically validate and verify? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so that you personally can validate and verify was more important here. So your community touches on a different issue, which is open source software inherently more reliable, fast moving than commercially licensed software? And the answer to that question is pretty much yes at this point. I will say that really depends on the community and their development practices and the strength of the community. And so there's lots of good negative examples where you can look at lots of projects where their practices aren't good, their quality is not consistent. But I think there are lots of good positive examples. And so Sayeed made this comment about it's the community that makes open source. And I went, no, it's a license to make open source, but it's the community that makes quality. And that's an unimportant distinction in my mind.
Sayeed, you had a comment?
Yeah, plus one to that, Randall. So I think another word I don't think we've explicitly said in addition to trust is transparency, right? And they're connected, but they're not exactly the same. So even if someone doesn't look at your code, the fact that it's transparent, that conveys a certain signal and gives them a certain level of confidence or assurance that you're not trying to do something behind their back. And this is not only sort of symbolic. There are tools that exist where you can look through the code and figure out what dependencies you have. And there's a framework called CHAOS, Community Health Analytics for Open Source Software, that assesses the health of software you're producing. All of those tools are much more effective if your code is open, right? It can go through and see those dependencies, whereas if it's closed, you go one layer down, two layer down, then you're done, right? You can't actually go look at any of the things that are there to be produced. So the transparency, I think, is an important dimension as well.
Yeah, I know. When I sold my company the first time around, we had to go through this whole, I think the company was Black Duck, and they went and did this like code review and compared it to anything they found on the web or anything, just to prove we weren't using anybody else. It's the same problem you were talking about, Randall, basically making sure there wasn't any forbidden outside code that was going to cause us headaches down the road. But it was really, I didn't think it was a very good process. I didn't think they did, frankly, a very good job of it, to be honest with you, in terms of what they could really check for. Whereas in open source, obviously, there's a lot more transparency. Dan, talk a little about your experience in open source, either in your companies or things you look for as an investor.
Well, I would back up the conversation a little bit to the, I realize that what's your target market? Who is it that you're trying to engage and in what way? And of course, being on the business side, the entrepreneurial side, I'm always thinking in terms of target markets, target customers, things along those lines. And, if you back things up, there once was a day where a buyer could do no wrong if they bought from IBM, right? You're not going to get in any trouble if you buy from IBM because, and buyers back then, and whether you're buying whether they were buying hardware or software, they wanted, there was a whole risk mitigation factor, and so the way you solved that, if you were a big buyer, is you bought from somebody you could hold accountable, or had a reputation of accountability out there. And so, that just adds that business aspect to a lot of the trust things, I think, that Sayeed and the group is alluding to, that the open source community looks at in a completely different way because, the world's much wider than it was way back. But still, at the end of the day, from a business perspective, you want to say, okay, well, what's my target market and how do I access them? And so, if you're selling financial back office software to CFOs and comptrollers, you're going to take a completely different approach. If you're building and selling software to software developers, which is a lot of what is out there, especially in the open source community, well, then you want to, a community, building a community is a great way to go because they're very interactive. They're going to add a lot of value. I mean, getting feedback when you're building and trying to sell getting customer feedback is huge. And if your target market is software developers in the first place, open source is just like a highway there. You can really get the interactive, stuff going. But, knowing your target market, I'm the private market guy. I'm trying to build something to sell it. What's my strategy for trying to sell it? How do I get thousands of users or thousands of sites deployed? And, is the capital there that I can do that? And in what way? And then how do I engage that? And then how do I worry about monetization later? So, that's sort of the way all of my organizations have looked at it, whether it's been, we've done part open source things to get engagement in some area and or to tap into a certain target market or target community that was direct or ancillary to the community that we were trying to engage. Because in a lot of places too, you sell a core product into an organization, but then they all have their own data scientists and or software developers that are doing reporting and things to pull out of there. So, how do you properly target and engage that community and come up with a strategy that's going to let you grow? And the open source world has just added a lot to be able to begin that thinking process to really, the strategy used to be pretty simple. I got to hire salespeople. I got to go knock on doors. I got to get it in front of people and I got to get them using it. And, give it to them free for a while, let them play with it, try to get them to adopt it, and then move on from there. But now it's a much more complex endeavor to take a piece of software to market. I'll just stop there without getting into the whole monetization aspect because there's so much. I'm sure that some of the other folks probably have some comments just on.
So I wanted to ask Dan a quick question, which is, the open source model of having an open source version of your product and an enterprise version of your product, which is the way a lot of software services do it. That was prime in 2016, 2017. Has the way that people think about that evolved, and is that less attractive than it used to be?
Well, it's just evolved to another level, right? Because now you provide the push button, you provide the software architecture, you provide the hard, you host it and everything, so it's as a service. And so then what are all the different add-ons you can have? You can have your core piece of software in the middle of it, but then you have maybe some reporting tools, some other one-off things that you have that aren't in the open source. And then likewise, you provide the online environment that it lives in, whether you build your own or you have it sitting on top of an AWS or something like that, but it's one stop shop, one push button, and that adds a whole nother level of, from the customer's perspective, it's a lot easier and it's a lot clearer on who's liable and responsible for what aspects of it. So yeah, I would say yes, but it's gone further, right? Because the world's now more online. So I don't know if that answered your question, Randall.
Sayeed.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, just the discussion that we just had and then the comment Randall made earlier about certain type of licenses that are, shall we say, more restrictive and less permissive. We had at one of these R++ sessions, we had Justin Colomino, who's the chief counsel for open source at Microsoft, speak, and Andrew and some others from Tech Ventures met with him. And he made a really good observation. So he sort of learned about universities as we interacted with them. And he said, it seems to me, researchers have a lot of autonomy. I said, yes, they do. And he said, so how about we sort of distinguish between the project and the product? And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, so it seems to me like the project is where it's generative, creative, you go get a grant and the researchers sort of, exploring as they should. And that's the nature of research, right? You don't necessarily even know where it's going to go. Showing up at that point and basically saying, you need to choose this license, you need to tell me, what you're going to do, so on, is probably not the best time, right? But what you can do maybe at that point is, what are the downstream effects of the choices you're making right now, right? So you may not know if you want to go to market, you may not know this or whatever, but if you choose this license, you can't go to market. You've now chosen a license that basically says you cannot do anything commercial with this. Are you sure that's what you want to do right now? So that sort of, there's that crossing that barrier between the project to the product. And I think the sort of academic freedom, the creativity, whatever, is very much at the project side of things. But if you want to move it to a product, or if you want to have a different kind of impact, you want to work with a community center, you want to release it free for education, whatever, understanding those consequences further upstream is really handy, right? So not to tell faculty this, thou shalt do the following, but if you choose the following, this is the consequence of what might happen downstream, and it might make it harder, so on. So I mentioned I'm at CMU and spoken to the tech transfer folks there, and they've said literally they get emails out of the blue from a company saying, CMU, you produce this software, we need you to sign this form, attesting the following, or you're releasing the following, and they're like, we don't even know what you're talking about. We have no idea what the software is, and could you give us a faculty name, for example? So maybe having that conversation earlier would be more productive.
Sayeed, I thought you did something very important here, figuring out sort of the enterprise GitHub. So we at Johns Hopkins trying to get the people who are releasing to all put it into like one place. So not only do you have cross-campus kind of trust, but then you have broader GitHub, open source trust as well.
Yeah, and to be very clear, when you say put it in one place, it's not like the OSPO manages it, right? You still manage your GitHub repos, you can still have private repos, you can still do all those kinds of things. It's just a layer, it's just a service layer that sits on top of what you're doing anyway. But then it allows, as you say, groups to come in and say, look at all the open source activity happening in these areas and so on.
We did have a question from the audience about basically business models similar to REDCap, which I guess, I don't know if some of you are aware of this. It's basically a clinical trial research management piece of software that I believe spun out of Vanderbilt like 10 or 20 years ago. The model, as I understand it from the question, is basically it's kind of here's this piece of software, but you can make money by selling services and customizations on top of this. And I think, that's kind of, I would say, from my experience, that's the other model, is basically you have your open source technology, but then you actually sell services to either interpret the results or set it up or customize it or whatnot as the other business model, as opposed to having sort of your free version, open source version, and your enterprise version. Randal or Dan, do you have any comments on sort of either of those models, or which one do you think works better?
I would say it's similar to what Randal was referring to, quite frankly. You know, the Red Cat model is similar to the other models, which is that when the monetization strategy is, at the end of the day, is you may have that open source piece of software, but at the end of the day, software is a living, breathing thing that's changing all the time and is breaking all the time, because the environments around it are always changing, as well as there's bugs in it that still haven't been found, et cetera, et cetera. And if you're a lone researcher, who do you call? You want to spend half your time debugging stuff whenever you stumble across something, or do you want to be able to have a support organization in place that you're paying something to, and you can call them and they'll help you work through it. At the end, you know, and that's the services. Likewise, that organization is in tune and engaging customers in that community, learning from them, developing add-ons and trying to make additional revenue along those lines, which is, you know, the same similar model. Red Hat, Red Cap, they're all along those kinds of, and then likewise, you know, now they've all moved into whether they, you know, put it in their own AWS or you know, big cloud environment and charge you for it, or whether you put it in theirs, your own, and they maintain it, and all of that sort of stuff at the end of the day has to be figured out, and somebody has to pay for the work that goes behind it. And I'll just leave it at that. Randal sure has an opinion.
Yeah, I wanted to say that these are not necessarily totally separable business strategies, that there's, in that a company may engage in multiple of them and there's some fluidity, right? So enterprise model is extra features, right? And that packages extra features or as add-ons or as services or as consulting. And I think ultimately companies end up engaging in some overlapping spectrum of those activities. And also the number of companies that you see their business model evolves. I will say we went to market with the idea that we were going to be GitHub, and we're just going to be users, and monetize on the cloud services differential. And I will say that I think if your model is to have a fully open source platform and then charge for a cloud use service, and you're trying to make the profit in the difference between what you're charging your customer and what you're paying to the cloud, that's a tough business model that's just a squeeze. And it's also not relationship based. So that was my personal experience, and there are counterexamples, but I have some skepticism there.
Sayeed.
I would just add to that just the one thing that I think to add to Randal's comment is that, but all those things together, you know, if a company's monetization strategy is to bring all that together so that the customer, the user at the end of the day has somebody to call. I mean, who do I call when I show up and it ain't working and it's not running? I mean, that peace of mind needs to be, people are willing to pay for sometimes.
Yeah, let me just comment on that, and then Sayeed, you're up next. When I ran my first software company, the thing that I was told by my venture capitalists is make sure you have an annual maintenance fee, 20% annual maintenance fee. And we had we didn't have an open source, but we had a free version of the product and a sort of an enterprise version of the product. And I was like, yeah, maintenance fee, like who's going to pay that? Once they've got the product, who cares? And I was shocked, like Bank of America, all the big companies, Bank of America and others, like clockwork would write the check. And it was for exactly what Dan was talking about. They want somebody to call, they want to make sure they're getting their updates. And like that check would just show up like clockwork. Like we didn't even have to do anything. I was sort of blown away, but it was all, they just wanted to make sure they had any problems. They wanted to make sure that they were not in arrears and we're going to have to like buy a new copy of the software or something, or we were going to kind of fleece them for that. So I always thought that was very interesting. Sayeed, you had a comment?
Yeah, I mean, this is, people will pay for peace of mind, right? This is at the heart of the insurance industry, right? It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. But you know, the point I wanted to make, again, I'll affirm everything, I'll plus one everything folks have said, is at the other side of that maintenance fee is a person, right, or set of people, right? So it's not enough to be able to say, yeah, if you give us 20% more, you'll get all that security. Somebody has to do that. Somebody has to fix those bugs, as Dan was pointing out. And I think in a university context, a really good question to ask is, do we want each research team to do that? Do we want each research team to go out and hire their own people and say, you know, this person that is probably grant funded, right? So grant to grant, or my grad student, you know, whoever is going to take that role. What's the continuity? What's the sustainability of that model? Or can something like an OSPO come along and say, we're going to provide this in a centralized way? You know, I don't mean in a bad way, coordinated way, whatever. And you probably don't have a full-time level of effort anyway, right? So if you have a team of people doing this for multiple projects, you know, somebody may be spending 15% on this team's output, you know, so open source software, and 10% on that, whatever. But that each of those labs is going to ask that question. I only have 15% of this person's time focused on this. Well, what do I do with the rest of their time? How do I support the rest of their time? So that just sort of economy of scale thing, I think, is another important question to think about, you know, with any of these service models.
Yeah, Andrew and I came from a meeting this morning, and, you know, just I can imagine, Sayeed, you would recognize this. You know, the software was built by multiple generations of grad students over time. Like, which pieces and what libraries and what other products were incorporated by various grad students over time to get to this point is definitely a challenge. Andrew, talk a little bit about kind of university perspective and what you've seen.
I was just going to add, honestly, Randall, we could use your dependency mapping tool, I think, for this project. I'm sorry, Mark, what's the question?
No, just talk a little about, you've been in more of these meetings than I have. I mean, what have you seen, and, you know, what's sort of the Hopkins perspective on open source now?
Well, I think part of something Sayeed said earlier about, you know, we don't have developers, we have researchers, it's like really illustrates the difference. You know, faculty have a lot of different reasons for open sourcing things besides their business model. Most fundamentally, is their software is not only technology, but it's their scholarship too. I mean, that is part of their reputation. It's part of what they're trying to do to, you know, further their research. And so, you know, more than anything, our open source questions are centered around, how do I correctly release this code so that it complies with my grant, or complies with my journal, or allows corporations to do some research with it themselves, not just universities, and things of that nature. And I think that's a really important function that university tech transfer offices can provide, because that is just helping faculty further the research, further their publication efforts, disseminate knowledge. I think for the subset of those people who you know, have an eye towards commercialization or are thinking about a business, there's a second layer that is, you know, a lot more complicated, that also gets into some of the things Sayeed says, which is, all right, I'll meet all my publication and scholarly obligations, but I also might want to do something business-wise with this long term. You know, that impacts the licensing decision, that impacts thinking about you know, other types of intellectual property. So there's other, you know, so the patents come into play. How valuable is your expertise connected to this software, and your connection with it to commercializing it down the road? And so, you know, that's like a second layer of the more commercial services that I think tech transfer offices should be offering faculty. And that's a complicated question, because, you know, it's hard to predict the future. And the typical way that tech transfer offices do this is, you know, you'll buy a patent, and that just sort of sits there, and it can be prosecuted and maintained. And if nothing ever happens, you can stop paying for it. If something does happen, you get money for it. And it's fairly simple and clean. You know, as I think Dan said, software is a living, breathing thing. So it changes. You have to think about like your release schedule. You have to think about, all right, if I do want to commercialize this, is like this set of features down the road something I'm going to want to protect in a different way or deliver in a different way. All those things come into play, and it's a lot faster, it's a lot more complicated, and it's all within a university context, which has all these other concerns and interests that the you know, the software creator is trying to serve at the same time. So
good. We have one other question from the audience about what about competitors? I mean, if everybody's got access to this thing, what happens? Like, what's the differentiation and how do you compete in the marketplace if you've got open source products? Randall, you want to take a crack at that one?
Yeah, so many companies choose to have an open source core, and then some of their product capabilities will not be open source. And so a good example of this is if you're providing, so this is what we did. We provided a service on the cloud where you could launch some combination of Jupyter Notebooks, Docker, Git, and then the open source core would run and would track all of your actions and build this complete history. So that's what the product did. But to provide that on the cloud, we had to do orchestration and billing and resource management and build networks. And so all of that software is complex and important, and the user experience to do that presents an obstacle to other people engaging. And so if you engineer that well, that's not something that your customer wants to buy. It's something that works as a service. So the difficulty of maintaining a competitive advantage in an open source world, particularly for the open source core of your product, is hard, particularly when you have huge companies that can drop massive engineering efforts. And I think one of the things to look at is when you take a huge internet company, what is their buy versus build decision when it comes to companies? And you track what companies that, so Nvidia for our company, but Google buys. And a lot of times buy versus build is very attractive. So, one of the things that I think is a problem with software in general, not specific to open source software, but is creating long-term independently sustainable enterprises in an environment with such massive tech companies. That's not this seminar, it's another seminar. But it's a real thing I worry about.
Dan, you had a specific example where I think one of your companies had a competitive open source product and you guys debated about, do I have that story straight?
No, I don't know. I don't recall what you're referring to.
I thought you said you had one company that was seriously debating about whether they should come out with an open source version because a competitor had threatened or something with an open source product or something like that. I can't remember the story.
Oh, right. No, so there was, we have a competitor that is somewhat open source, but it's not, what we found is that, it came to the market after us. This would be Qualytics, and the competitor name slips my mind right now, but it'll come to me in a minute. But their features are not evolving very fast. I don't know if the community is just not as active where, we've got a funded paid organization of developers and, sales and marketing people and customer success people that are working very actively with customers, and we're releasing new features that are targeting very specific needs very quickly. Whereas that open source product that claims to do the same thing, likewise, similar to the API issue and the ease of use issue on different platforms and stuff, it's not moving quickly. If you want to adopt it, you might have to bring it to your own platform, where we're very specific, rolling out our ability to work specifically on all these different platforms, and or can tell you when we will be on a platform, and we'll be able to interface with that platform with appropriate support at a given time. So, there's a lot to the sales and marketing aspect to the business as well. We've seen that in software over the years. We've seen the not the best product win in the marketplace. That happens in software
All the time.
and so there's a number of ways to win, so to speak. So
great. Sayeed, you had a comment?
Yeah. So I think it's important to know that not everything needs to be open source, right? That sometimes it may not be the best choice, and that's perfectly fine. But I also think it's important to, and I'm not saying any of the panelists or even the participants are asserting this, but it's not binary, right? It's not a 1-0 kind of choice. There are these so-called restricted licenses that prohibit commercial use. Then there are very permissive licenses that allow you to do pretty much anything you want with the code. And there's a spectrum there, right? And I don't mean to put Andrew on the spot, but I think he shared when I was at Hopkins a slide that kind of lays these out in that spectrum. So there are ways you can actually, license the code in a way that your competitors' benefit you, right? So it's sort of this. If you're going to use these things, then we get a cut type of, putting that very simplistically, if you will, and maybe naively. So there's this range of choices. It's important to keep that in mind. But the last point I want to make on this thread is that the federal funders are thinking about how to write policies for universities, right? They're doing that right now. So the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy just released a 2020 version of the Memorandum on Public Access. And it fundamentally moved the emphasis. It made some very important changes in how you share, papers coming out of research grants. But it fundamentally shifted a lot of the attention to data. There's very clear statements now around data management sharing. So on NIH has a policy that's going to be active in 2 months in January. And I do not represent OSTP. I don't work for OSTP, just to be very, very clear. But in conversations I've had with them and in some of their public announcements and so on, it's very clear that the emphasis is going to shift to software at some point fairly soon, right? So this is partially what I'm getting at is, do we want individual researchers having to make the case? Do we want Hopkins or CMU alone to make the case? Or do you want a network, like a group of OSPOs coming together and saying, here are the use cases our faculty have identified, and here are the concerns that need to be conveyed. And if you make the policy in this way, you're clobbering 30% of these cases. Or if you shift it slightly, you'll address all these other kinds of things. That is something they're looking for. With the first 2 versions of these public access memos, we reacted to what they had done, right? They put it out there and suddenly everybody went, oh, now what do we do? I think we have a chance to influence how that policy gets developed and written for software. And I think that's a really important point to keep in mind here.
Yeah, good point. And clearly the government's getting involved here. I think we're getting close to the end. I wanted to sort of take 1 second. We did have a question about Johns Hopkins policy on open source and sort of software ownership. And Andrew, I think that falls in your bailiwick.
What's the question? Oh, so I can speak in generalities, and for specifics, we have a IP policy. It's a public document. You can just search it on the web. It's JHU IP policy. But it basically employees of the university, so faculty, staff, people like me, the university owns intellectual property in what you create, generally speaking. So that includes copyright and other intellectual property rights in the code. For undergraduate students in particular, generally speaking, they own the intellectual property and things they create. And then there's special cases in between there that are all fact dependent. And it usually has to do with what type of outside funding contributed to that creation. So that's about as clearly as I could say that right now.
And then we're doing some stuff on open source now. I mean, we've sort of modified our approach. Andrew?
Sure. Well, I mean, so that doesn't change ownership. Ownership happens the way it happens. But as far as the university's posture towards open source releases and commercialization of open source projects and any other type of licensing around that, that is something people like Mark and I primarily are heavily working on trying to facilitate. But in general, anyone looking to commercialize open source at JHU, we are happy to help, and I think have some tools to provide that type of assistance.
Yeah, I think Andrew and I are part of a team that really focuses a lot on software, and so we're opening up, trying to open up a lot more opportunities for software, open source, not open source, to create those opportunities and support those opportunities for commercialization, if that's what a faculty member wants to do. We're certainly here to help. So that's definitely part of this.
So
One last
I wanted
question.
to chime in real quick on this issue because I have lots of faculty and students that have read the intellectual property documents and come away with the impression that the university owns everything that they do, and that wouldn't allow them to open source their software. And that's not the practical interpretation. That's not what Andrew said either, which is that for the most part, the decision to open source research is, open source software at the university level is up to the investigators and teams that do it. And it doesn't cede the university's interest in the intellectual property. And that's something to talk to Andrew and Mark about. So don't feel inhibited to license your open source. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And anybody who's on the call wants to and is Hopkins related, feel free to reach out to us anytime, Andrew or me. We'd be happy to chat with you about that. All right, lightning round question for all of you. Where, we've talked about open source a lot in tools, a lot in sort of behind the covers, a lot in algorithms. What are sort of some key markets or key areas or key projects you've seen that really, show sort of the success of open source? Sayeed, you want to start?
Well, I'll give you the one that I heard about latest. Is a group of undergraduate and graduate students at CMU have written some software that'll be used for one of the Ranger robots on the moon. Some of you may have seen the Artemis launch yesterday. So it looks like we're going back to the moon. And apparently one of the robots will be something called Ranger. And the software that underpins that robot is open source.
That's cool. Space, always a good place. Randall.
Yeah, I want to talk about React, which is made by Meta, because it opens a different theme that we haven't covered, which is one of the huge contributors to the quality of open source software out there are large companies that sell other things. And then, so Facebook is not trying to sell a front end for JavaScript, right? But they have written this beautiful framework and it's open source and it drives a huge fraction of the web. And that's just an incredible market force that's added to the open software ecosystem in a way that is was unimaginable 20 years ago.
The frameworks in general, or just, you think that's an area to be focused on?
Well, so having, I was at IBM when IBM committed to open source, where they said, we're going to do open source for all our operating systems. So just having open source software be a model for companies to do software development, and then it gets contributed to the community is incredible, and it's incredibly powerful. And they have OSPOs now for that reason too.
There you go. Andrew, what are you seeing from the Hopkins side?
Just in general about open source? Or...
Yeah, what markets or what projects have you seen that sort of, make you think about open source as an option?
Well, I think cybersecurity, we see a lot of researchers working on those projects and just publishing those tools, and have had a lot of meetings recently where we're learning that for-profit companies are using those tools and providing cybersecurity services to some very large customers. And so those faculty are interested in how they might be able to participate in that type of activity. And so I think, Hopkins, we have this very large health reputation, but, we're in Maryland, there's a lot of cyber activity. And I think that's something that we might see some more success commercializing those types of tools in the future.
Yeah, when I started my first company, I was in the cyberspace, and Marty Roche started a company called Snort. And it started on this open source product that he built. That was a penetration analysis, network analysis tool, and built a huge, sort of a following for that. And then built a commercial product and a company and sort of took it from there. And I still laugh because I think a company ultimately was wildly successful and was acquired. But I still remember Marty building the first booth at the first trade show we went to together. It's pretty darn funny by himself. Dan, markets or projects you've seen where you think open source applies?
I think that my initial thought to that was not specifically a market, but more along the whole collaborative aspect of addressing a problem and putting my entrepreneurial hat on, and where I'm looking for opportunities to try to take something to the next level and take it to market. If you see some, if I could see some open source projects that built huge communities, there's a need there to figure out how to put the market-based support infrastructure and accountability in place for that. So that's really the only thing I would add. I haven't seen anything over the top. It always seems to me that it's a good place where it dabbles in the market, and if it starts to get a following, then maybe there's an entrepreneurial opportunity there, and then I take a look.
So it's like a leader. It's like a loss leader. Get a lot of users and then build out a business on top of that.
Yeah, see, it's a way of getting community and or market feedback in a lot of ways.
Awesome. All right, gentlemen, we're at the top of the hour. I appreciate your time. Sayeed, Randal, Andrew, Dan, I appreciate your time, appreciate your thoughts. This has been enormously helpful. Let me once again thank Mark Vanderzijl and the folks at Fast Forward for running this. We'll have recorded this session. We'll make it available on our website. But thanks again, everyone, for participating. This was super interesting. I learned a lot.